France has been weakened politically, economically, and militarily by the chaos resulting from 5 years of revolution. Now at war with the better part of Europe, the revolutionary ideals and freedoms that many have lost their heads over are in jeopardy. France needs someone to lead her through the chaos of the aftermath of the revolution, bring peace, but also maintain the rights and freedoms given to the French people by that revolution. France needs Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born on Corsica in 1769 to an impoverished family. Due to excellent performance in the army, the French Revolutionary Government, the Directory, gave Napoleon command of the Army of Italy in 1796. After all, what could a poor Corsican do with an equally poor army? Little did they know that that poor Corsican would, just 3 years later, hold absolute power in France, and Europe would be plunged into almost 20 years of war, resulting in the tragic deaths of millions. And therein lies a great tragedy for Napoleon, because he's remembered for wars, many of which were not of his own making. But the legacy of Napoleon is not just one of death and destruction. Far from it, for Napoleon's greatest legacies and triumphs lie in his enduring progressive policies and reforms that form the world today by ensuring rights, drastically improving education, and even changing the way objects were measured. Napoleon, the poor Corsican with an army, defeated the Austrians in Italy, forcing their capitulation, and led an expedition to Egypt, bringing back ancient treasures and tales from faraway lands, and returned to France, a hero. Napoleon used this newfound popularity, and the growing unpopularity of the Directory, to become first consul of France. And after defeating the Austrians again, Napoleon finally made peace with France's enemies at Amiens, and France, after being at war for 8 years, was finally at peace. In addition to reforming the army, Napoleon worked day and night picking up the pieces of a country broken by wars and revolution, personally overseeing every major project in France. He worked hard to make France one of the most progressive nations of its time. Napoleon improved the lives of his subjects by creating a new educational system, introducing the metric system in France, and abolishing the Jewish ghettos. He also restored many bishops who had remained loyal to the revolution, giving the French people the freedom to practice their faith. Napoleon's greatest reform was the Code Civil, or Napoleonic Code, which set forth laws governing property and personal identity. It was based off the Roman Civil Code, and created a system of civil law. It was progressive for its time, and kept many freedoms of the Revolution. It allowed same-sex acts, forbade marriage without consent, and divorce without mutual consent. The Code Civil became the basis for France's legal system, and was Napoleon's greatest legacy. In Napoleon's short time spent administering France, order was restored. The French Revolution made politics and everyday life chaotic, and Napoleon's rule restored the order that had existed in the years before the Revolution. Had he been allowed to continue, France might have become far more advanced socially, economically, and technologically than other European countries. However, the great powers of Europe had other plans, ones which would not allow Napoleon's continued civil reform. With civil success and the restoration of order and peace in France came popularity. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Austria, wanting revenge for its 2 prior defeats, declared war on France. Napoleon skillfully destroyed 2 Austrian armies, created the Confederation of the Rhine, an alliance of pro-French German states, and dissolved the age-old Holy Roman Empire. By 1807, after defeating Prussia and Russia, France was hegemon of Europe. Sporadic wars with Austria and Britain forced Napoleon to defend France instead of rule it. So after defeating Austria, Napoleon created the Continental System, which banned all European trade with Britain to force them to make peace. Russia refused to comply with this system, so Napoleon invaded in 1812, committing his gravest mistake. Although he defeated the Russian armies and captured Moscow, he could not defeat the Russian winter, and his grand army of 600,000 men lost half its strength. Napoleon retreated to Germany, but was defeated by overwhelming numbers and was forced to retreat to France. Despite the overwhelming numbers of enemy soldiers, Napoleon staged a brilliant defensive campaign in northern France, but in 1814 he was defeated and forced to abdicate. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, and the French monarchy was restored. In France, the Bourbon king had become very unpopular because he had taken away many of the freedoms the French people had during the reign of Napoleon. Hearing this, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France. He was welcomed as a savior. The people supported him. Napoleon was content with just France, but the powers of Europe were not. In 1815, seeing Napoleon as a threat, his old enemies declared war on him. Overwhelmed by the enemy soldiers, Napoleon was defeated and forced to abdicate. Rather than staying and being executed by the Prussians, Napoleon surrendered to the British and died in exile in 1821 on St. Helena at the age of 51. The Napoleonic Wars caused the tragic deaths of around 2 million people, and Europe was devastated by years of war. Napoleon's foreign policy was dominated by a lack of compromise. He would often demand rather than negotiate, and would often favor his own people, the French people, over those in conquered territories, funneling economic resources to France, which made the European powers hostile towards him. However, Napoleon rarely declared war on other countries, only doing so with Portugal in 1808 and Russia in 1812, and only to force Britain to negotiate peace. The rest of the wars he fought were against nations which had declared war on France. Napoleon represented the middle ground between the orderly aristocratic ways of Europe before the Revolution and the rights, freedoms, and philosophy of the Revolution and the Enlightenment. Napoleon provided the order that the monarchy had and the rights and freedoms of the Revolution. Because of this, Napoleon enjoyed large amounts of popular support, particularly by peasants, even after the years of war, because Napoleon gave them a safer environment to practice their new freedoms than the French Republic had. The French now had a taste, however small, of what freedom was like, and although the French monarchy was reinstated, it was limited by a constitution. Such was Napoleon's popularity that when his body was returned to France in 1840, thousands came to pay their respects. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was relative peace in Europe for the next 100 years, and 2 major powers were established, Britain and Russia. Napoleon's military reforms are widely used, and his education reforms were so effective that they are still in place in France today. Thanks to Napoleon's conquests, the metric system is the most widely used system of measurement in the world. Also thanks to Napoleon's conquests, the progressive Code Civil and civil law became the basis of laws in most of the world's countries. But many people also see Napoleon as a brutal dictator. This is not without some merit, but much of this tyrannical image of Napoleon was created by British propaganda. Many of Napoleon's enemies, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and others, were absolute monarchies, much like Napoleon's France. This one-sided, tyrannical image of Napoleon is his greatest tragedy. Although Napoleon was eventually defeated on the battlefields of history, where many great people are lost and forgotten, lies Napoleon's final victory, his greatest triumph. The enduring policies and reforms that ensured rights, drastically improved education, and even changed the way objects were measured, and which have formed the world into what it is today.